Good morning, Professor.
Good morning, Sir Brian.
Good morning, Ms. Richards. Let me just say a word or two before we start for those people who may not have been with us earlier this week, the people who are watching this remotely. It's a number which changes day by day, Professor, and some people, I suspect, may not have been watching so far. But just to describe to them where we are, we, that is Ms. Richards, myself, are in London, in the hearing room in Fleetbank House. There are 4 members of the council team sitting, facing me. There are 3 members of the inquiry staff in the room, and there is one person who is whose job it is to make sure we see the right documents at the right time. Professor, you're in Edinburgh. You're in a room on your own, in your solicitor's offices, with your solicitor and counsel watching from other rooms or remote. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes.
You've been sworn on the first day. This is the 3rd day of your evidence. Thank you for your endurance. And let us begin.
Before we begin, I wonder if I could go back to some evidence that I was giving yesterday in relation to what the patients knew about the developing AIDS situation in 1983 and 84. Yesterday evening I was reflecting on this, and I remembered that about a week ago I was given sight of 2 Rule 9 witness statements from my registrars, Dr. Robert Carr and Dr. John Tucker, and both these address this issue, and I thought it might be helpful to the inquiry if I brought it to their attention on this topic.
Thank you, Professor, and we do indeed have the statements of Dr. Tucker and Dr. Carr.
Thank you.
And they have been read and will no doubt be considered further.
Thank you.
I should add that although obviously what is heard orally and particularly visually on screen may have more immediate impact, every piece of evidence that we have in written form in answer to a request is read and forms part of the body of evidence. Just because somebody isn't called doesn't mean to say their evidence is not important.
I understand that. Thank you.
Professor Ludlam, I was asking you when we finished yesterday about the meeting in December of 1984, and I just have a small number of further questions relating to that meeting. I understand your evidence to be that every patient in Scotland was invited to the meeting. So that would include presumably patients with mild and moderate haemophilia A, as well as severe haemophilia A, patients with haemophilia B, and patients with von Willebrand's disease.
Well, it was my understanding that that's what had happened, and that was what the proposal was that I discussed with Dr. Forbes from Glasgow. Excuse me. In retrospect, I think there may have been a misunderstanding. I'm not sure how many patients were invited from out with Southeast Scotland. Most of the patients who came, I recognised, and they came with their partners. There may have been, I think, maybe a few people I didn't recognise and who may have come from elsewhere. So I certainly wouldn't say all patients in Scotland, but all patients with all degrees of severity of these bleeding disorders were invited.
At least from Edinburgh, you're able to say that?
From Edinburgh and South East Scotland, yes.
And in terms of the clinicians who were present, it was yourself and Dr. Forbes?
And Dr. McClellan from blood transfusion.
Now, we know from the evidence you've given previously and the evidence you gave yesterday that in terms of your Edinburgh patients, you'd sent off, I think by that stage, perhaps somewhere between 50 and 70 samples to Dr. Tedder, at least that's what your Penrose evidence suggests, and you'd received back 16 HTLV3 positive results. Do you know whether any of the patients in other centres, including Glasgow, whether tests have been undertaken in relation to those patients by the time of this meeting?
I think some samples had been sent from Glasgow to Professor Gallo in the States. I don't know when the results of those were received, but when they sent, if and when they sent samples to Dr. Tedder, I'm afraid I don't know.
At the meeting on the 19th of December, how did you seek to ensure that patients understood clearly what was being said? And how did you ascertain that they had properly understood what was being said?
Well, Dr. Forbes, myself, and Dr. McClelland gave short presentations. I didn't think were too complicated, but set out all that we knew at the time. There was then a period of discussion for quite a long time, answering questions from the audience, and the topics were developed in the responses. We were very open about the situation, about the testing, and particularly that we had results that we would be happy to share with the patients if they would like them. We emphasized the importance of safety precautions. And so I think, if you like, through the responses in the discussion, it seemed to me that they had understood the situation and what we were trying to convey. The discussion, as I say, went on for about 3/4 of an hour or so, and when no more questions, then we or Dr. Forbes, who was chairing the meeting, closed the meeting.
Did any patient in the course of the main part of the meeting ask the question, have I been infected? Am I one of those? Did any patients come up to you or Dr. Forbes afterwards and ask that question?
I don't think so, no.
The inquiry's heard some evidence of which you're aware, although I'm not going to go into the details of any individual case, Professor, but some evidence that at least some who attended the meeting may have left believing that what was said didn't really apply to them, because they would have been told if they were HTLV3 positive. Do you understand or accept that that is a situation that could have arisen?
I was very surprised that has been said, because of the response that I got thereafter from the vast majority of patients who got in touch with me or with the Haemophilia sister and came and wanted to discuss the situation further. The first occurred 2 days later. I saw someone shortly before Christmas. Most of them took a little while, perhaps a month or two before they came, because we had pointed out at the meeting some of the difficulties, I think, in interpreting the results of the test.
May I just ask? Was the Yorkshire Post article published?
Yes, it was published the following day.
Published the following
And there
day?
were- the following day.
And that article
and-
was to the effect, was it, that a number of people had tested positive?
Yes, and there were follow-up articles in Scottish newspapers. I think perhaps on the 21st they had picked it up.
Thank you.
On the Yorkshire Post.
Yes,
So
we
it
may
was
have the Yorkshire Post.
well established in the public press what had happened, and there were consequences for the Haemophilia Centre and the patients because of that.
Professor, what do you mean by consequences for the Haemophilia Centre and the patients?
Well, I think it became, we had the first patients in Scotland who were known to be anti-HTLV3 positive, at least publicly. And that was in the newspapers, and that led to great concern but immediately in the hospital, because we were suddenly seen as the ward that had AIDS patients in it, which we didn't. We had people who tested positive for the presumed virus. But the effect of that was that, for example, there was a reluctance of some, not people in the haemophilia team, but general hospital staff, actually to provide their usual services for the patients. For example, patient in a hospital bed, the porters would be very reluctant or refuse to take them down on a trolley down to the X-ray department. So there were all these immediate consequences of this information coming out.
So we do have the Scotsman article of the 21st of December 1984, and there is in fact one question may be useful to ask Professor Ludlam about that. It's HSOC 0016028. I should say we do have the Yorkshire Post article somewhere as well, but I don't have the reference for that to hand. This is the Scotsman, 21st of December 1984. AIDS virus found in infirmary blood supply. If we pick it up at the second and third columns, it says Dr. Christopher Ludlam, a consultant haematologist who is director of the Edinburgh Haemophilia Centre, said antibodies to AIDS had been found in his patient's blood, but that did not mean they would necessarily contract the disease. He said all the patients were clinically well, and he estimated that the chance of their actually developing AIDS is 1 in 2,000. He added, however, that not enough was known about the natural history of the virus to be able to say when the patients might be considered to be safe from the threat of the disease. And then it goes on to talk about a Bournemouth incident. Is that a correct assessment of or description of what you said? And where did the 1 in 2,000 figure derive from?
I don't know where the 1 in 2,000 came from. I don't recall the Scotsman contacting me about this, and I wouldn't have put the estimate at 1 in 2,000, as you know. I would have put it less than that, or a greater risk than that, as I was saying yesterday.
So for your information, for your note, I won't put it up on screen, but the Yorkshire Post article is at PRSE 304577.
Thank you.
In terms of the reaction of those who were at the meeting, what can you recall about the mood of those who were there when they had this information explained to them?
There was surprise and disappointment, and they were perplexed. and upset. That's my memory. I'm sorry, with passage of time, the detail has gone. That's the feeling I have that I'm left with for the meeting. It was a difficult meeting, but it was all handled in a very calm way.
Now, you spoke yesterday about the letter which was sent after the meeting to patients, inviting them to a consultation, which we don't, at least currently, have a copy of. Where, in terms of the individual letters that were sent to patients, would those be placed on the patient's records?
No, I don't think so.
So where would those letters be?
I'm afraid copies wouldn't have been, I think, put, because it was a sort of duplicated letter. We learned subsequently, when we came to send out information, for example, about variant CJD, which was a similar, if you like, notification. We put copies of absolutely everything that we sent to the patients in the case notes, but we didn't put, nor did we put in the case notes, I think, the letter of invitation to the meeting on the 19th.
Can I ask you to look at two passages in your witness statement? Just want to try and get a sense of what the letter might have said. WITN 3428001, please, Shomik, page 95. So if we look at paragraph 253, just go slightly down, thank you. If we pick it up 6 lines down, you say, subsequently, all patients were written to, letting them know that a result might be available, and that if they wish to know the result, they should make an appointment to see me in person. And then you refer to the AIDS information sheet, which we do have a copy of. Does it follow from that this was a letter that, again, went to every single patient, including those who were mild, von Willebrands, those who had not yet been tested?
Yes, everyone on our register.
And then, if we go to paragraph 268, please, Shomik, which is page 99. You'll see the way in which you've put it in paragraph 268. All registered patients and parents were written to and sent the information sheet. There was an accompanying letter which encouraged patients to make an appointment if they would like further information or discuss their individual situation. Now, there's potentially a difference between a letter which says, do make an appointment if you want further information or to come and speak to us, and a letter which talks in terms about there being an available test result. Doing the best you can, given that we don't have the letter, are you able to assist us any further with what this letter actually said to patients?
I can't add further than the statements you've got, but in the information sheet that accompanied the letter, I think there's reference made to anti-HTLV3 results being available or could be measured.
We'll just have a look at that. It's I've got various references for it. Can we try Shomik PRSC 302785? Is this the information sheet, Professor?
That's correct, yes.
So we can see it sets out the opportunity to contact the director. What is AIDS? Where did it come from? If we go down the page, who does it affect? And reference to bloodborne transmission. Why does immunity alter? And then if we go over the page, How does it affect patients? So that's a description of what may happen in relation to the syndrome. What's the virus? It says here, sorry, we'll just pause. I think this may be what you were referring to, Professor, correct me if I'm wrong. 5 lines in, these tests are now available and will be carried out on your routine visits to your centre. Now, that doesn't seem to be an invitation for patients to come in and find out their test results. It seems to be telling patients that if they want to be tested, they can be.
Yes, but it makes it clear that there is a test.
Yes. In terms of the process then for telling patients their individual diagnosis, your witness statement suggests, I think, that the majority of patients contacted the centre over the next 1 to 3 months. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Was there any delay in patients then being seen, or did you make particular arrangements to see any patient who contacted you for a result as soon as possible?
I saw them pretty promptly. They were seen, they say, mostly out with the clinic time, and they were put in my diary as a if you like, a visitor to come and see me at a time that was mutually convenient by my secretary.
Now, in terms of sheer numbers, the majority of your patients hadn't, as a matter of fact, been tested by the time of the 19th of December 1984. I think if you sent 50 or 70 results off to Dr. Tedder, you had 200 or so patients, I think, at the time.
Yeah.
So what happened in relation to the remaining majority of patients for whom you didn't have test results as at the end of 84?
When patients came up to see me or to see someone else in the centre, we would discuss the result if we had it. If we we would say that it's if I can put it this way, a provisional result for all sorts of reasons I'm happy to go into. But we, on most occasions, offered a second sample, to take a sample at the time that they came up to see us, to send off to confirm the first, because we didn't want to rely upon a single result, again, for all sorts of reasons that I could go into if it would be helpful. So all patients, or at least particularly all positive patients, had a second test.
And patients who were coming to see you who hadn't been in the group who had stored samples sent off to Dr. Tedder and so needed to be tested for the first time, what were the arrangements that were made for their testing?
Well, if they came and asked about testing, we didn't have a result from a stored sample, I would explain that and offer to take blood and send it to Dr. Tedder for testing.
And can you... I'm sorry.
I was going to say after telling them a bit about the test, because they may not have been at the meeting. They'll have received the information sheet, but I would have talked a bit about the test and its implications, obviously, before testing them.
And so your account, I think, in your statement is that the majority of patients did make appointments. Do you mean by that the majority of the patients who you knew to be HTLV3 positive, or the majority of your 200 or so patients?
I believe the majority of those who were anti-HTLV3 positive came. A large number of other patients who came, but there were also quite a lot of people who were had mild bleeding disorders and who only visited the centre perhaps once a year. There were fewer of that group of patients who came, and they would be probably reviewed subsequently.
And do you recall whether there were delays in getting any those further test results back? Were you using Dr. Tedder's facility again, or a different one by this time?
Initially, the samples went to Dr. Tedder, as you will have gathered. He was receiving a large number of requests. In fact, he and Philip Mortimer at National Institute of Biological Standards and Control, I think, were the only two laboratories initially able to do the test. Our local virologists, Dr. Guthera and Dr. Peter Simmons, who were initially primarily interested in hepatitis B, and they were working with the blood transfusion service over its arrangements for screening patients. They were very much in touch with us because they did the hepatitis B testing, routine testing for us. And so they very quickly set up anti-HCV3 testing in Edinburgh. It perhaps became available sometime in the spring, I think, of 1985.
You also sent a letter to GPs, which we'll just have a look at briefly. It's WITN 3428010. So this is this is just one example. I think we've seen others which are in identical format, just with a different GP name. 31st of January. You'll be aware from both the medical and popular press that patients with haemophilia are at risk of developing AIDS as a result of the transmission of HDLV3 virus, and then you give some information about that. You suggest that it's important that precautions are the same precautions are observed as for hepatitis B positive patients. And then in your second paragraph, you say, I write to let you know I've circularised your patient with an information sheet about AIDS. You then set out what the chief recommendations are. If we go on, please, to the next page, Shomek. Just zoom in on that. You then say in the penultimate paragraph, you talk about the concentrates now being heat treated. You say it's obviously an anxious time for your patient. If you'd like to discuss any of the points I've raised further, I'd be delighted to hear from you by telephone or letter. Now, did you get any response from GPs asking for clarification as to whether their patients were infected, because this letter would have left that position open?
I don't think I did, actually. No, I don't remember any GPs phoning up or writing.
In terms of providing...
But could I just add to that? And that may be because the Haemophilia Centre really provided also a general practitioner service, as well as a treatment for bleeding disorders service, that patients, if they had a health concern that I might take to my general practitioner, the patients with haemophilia would tend to bring it to the Haemophilia Centre because it might be that their symptom is related to a bleed, and that might not be appreciated by a general practitioner. So the general practitioners would certainly know that their patient had haemophilia, but they might not see them very often because we provided much of the acute general practitioner service, if I can put it like that.
Did there come a point, either in relation to individual patients or in relation to patients en masse, where you did inform GPs of individual patients' HTLV3 results?
Certainly not en masse. We discussed with each patient individually about whether or not we should let the general practitioner know. In general, I was keen that the GPs knew, but not if this was going to compromise anything for the patient. And it, when patients, after discussion, if they said they were prepared for me to let the GP know, then I would usually phone the GP. I wouldn't write. I would phone and discuss the situation with the doctor, and we would come to some arrangement. The letters often were sent out marked strictly confidential. Whatever, they tended to be rather individual arrangements actually for each of the positive patients. So there were a relatively small number, so we could cope with that, if I can put it that way, on an individual basis. There were, as I was explaining on Monday, we cover a very large geographical area, and quite a number of patients live in quite small communities. And there was quite a lot of concern, very understandable concern, that if the general practitioners knew of the patient's anti-HTLV status, that might leak out into the rural community. So it was difficult, and we had patients from the islands in Scotland, where the number of patients is small and they're almost identified as individuals with haemophilia. So it was a very difficult area, and we took it patient by patient, GP by GP. GPs were very understanding and very helpful, and I think the arrangements worked pretty well most of the time.
And how confident are you that there was a letter sent to patients after the 19th of December meeting, rather than just the sending of the circular, the information sheet?
Well, I would have, I'm sure, sent out a letter with it, because it was an information sheet, and I was trying to convey other things as well. I think Glasgow sent out a letter with it was going to be originally the same information sheet, and I thought the same one had been actually sent out from Glasgow, but I subsequently discovered that it had been modified slightly.
Now, again, I'm not going to ask you about individual cases. Your statement suggests that there were two patients who, after 2 years, still didn't know their result because they hadn't responded to any invitation to proactively contact the centre. Is that correct? And then you've said there was a very small number of patients who positively declined to know the result.
That's also correct, yes.
So again, I want to be very careful about not dealing with specific individuals. But in terms of the time period then, that would give us, would it, approximately 1987 for the two who you said hadn't, sorry, I'm looking at your statement, Professor, it might be easier to put it on the screen, WITN 3428001. Page 104. And I'm just looking at paragraphs 292 and 3, the bottom half of the page. The last two sentences of paragraph 292, you say after 2 years, you refer to there being two individuals who hadn't inquired about their antibody status. So there'd be two patients who were finding out for the first time in around 1987. Is that broadly accurate?
Yes, I think one was the end of 1986, and one was very early in January 1987.
And then in paragraph 293, you've said a very small number of patients who, when asked if they would like to know the result, were adamant they didn't wish to know. Again, without talking about individuals or revealing any information about individuals, are you able to assist us with the time frame over which the patients who fall within the category you've described in page 293 ultimately became aware or were told their HDLV3 status? Or were they never told by you?
I can't remember when they eventually heard. It was a very difficult situation because the two patients, if I can go back to say that the two patients who we were talking about a moment ago who didn't know until end of 1986, early 1987, were both individuals who had been at the meeting. I remembered that. Moving forward to the 293 paragraph and the ones who didn't want to know, one of the people I have in mind wasn't at the meeting, so I made a point of seeing him at an appropriate time and asking him if he would like to know, letting him know that we had the test available, and I was quite surprised he didn't want to know, and I was surprised. Tried to encourage him because I thought he really ought to know, but I was very clear with him about the precautions he had to take to prevent the possibility of infecting other people if he was positive. I said we were giving the same advice to everybody. It was of particular concern to me because I saw that there was the possibility that he could, for reasons I don't want to go into at the moment unless you press me, the other people could be at risk, not a big risk, but I was just a bit concerned, and I would have felt more comfortable if he had known, but I suspect he must have thought he might well be positive by the way I was being so emphatic. much more emphatic, if you like, than I had been with him a year or two, or with all patients previously, when one said, look, if you cut yourself or blood gets spilt, be careful with it, mop it up yourself, and rather than let other people do it, and so on. So the tenor of my advice had changed. But he was a bright, intelligent young man. He didn't want to know. I'd made the offer. And we made several attempts. He was, if you like, offered a result, the opportunity to know the result on other occasions. We tried to visit him at home, but we got no response to that. He was working away from
Professor,
Edinburgh.
I'm going to stop you there, because I just want to be very careful that nothing is said that could identify individuals.
I understand that.
Can I just ask you this? Do you have a sense of the point in time at which, whoever they might have been, the last of your patients who had been infected was informed? Do you have any sense of how long that was? If you can't answer that without looking at individual case records, then I won't press you. But do you have an idea?
If you'd asked me a few years ago, I would have known exactly. I don't want to speculate. If you want to know, and if I had access to the records, I could, of course, help you.
I won't ask you further about that, Professor. Can I ask you to look at a letter from June of 1985? It's at MACK 302601_001, please. This is a letter which you sent on the 25th of June 1985 to the Committee on the Safety of Medicines. It's in relation to an identified batch of SMBTS factor 8. You say that you're writing formally to report it would appear the above patch transfused during the spring of last year to patients may have contained the HTLV3 virus. Most of our patients were negative for anti-HTLV3 before the spring of last year, and during the succeeding months, a number of patients developed antibodies. You explain you've examined the transfusion records, and the above batch would appear to be one that was most likely to have caused the infection. And then you say this: I send you the names of the individual haemophiliac infected in very strict confidence. No doubt you'll wish to undertake your own inquiry. I should be grateful if the list of patients concerned was not passed to any other organisation without my personal consent. Although some of the patients realise they have received a contaminated batch and know they've developed anti-HTLV3, other patients do not know this and do not wish to know. Now, Professor, I understand the basis for what you're setting out in the first paragraph. Why were you sending the Committee on the Safety of Medicines the names of your individual patients who tested positive for HTLV3?
I can't recall, and looked at from at the moment, I can't understand why I did so. I can't recall whether I had a discussion, perhaps a phone discussion with the CSM, and they had asked for the names. I'm sorry, I can't. I agree, looked at just now, it would not seem to be an essential piece of information.
It must have been done without, at the very least, the consent and knowledge of the patients who didn't know that they were infected. did you take any steps before sending this letter to speak to the patients who did know and explain to them that you were going to be sending this data to a third-party body and ask for their agreement?
I don't think so, no.
In terms of testing family members for HTLV3, what arrangements were made for testing spouses, partners, or others who might be at risk?
We offered testing for partners. We were keen that partners were tested. Other family members, we didn't routinely recommend testing, but if individuals were particularly keen to be tested, then we discussed that with them and would offer them the test if they still wanted it after we'd had the discussion.
You had some stored samples of family members. Did you test those for HTLV3 without, either with the patient's knowledge and consent or without it? So with the relative's knowledge or consent or without it?
I don't think so, no.
Can we just look at WITN 3428007? This is a letter 27th of January 1986. This is a blank one, but I think the inquiry has seen at least one example of one which has patient names on. It talks about hepatitis in the first paragraph, so it's 27th of January 86. Second paragraph says second line, very occasionally hepatitis is transmitted to other members of the family. We believe this to be a very rare occurrence. We would, however, like to investigate local families to find out how commonly this occurs. And then you say in the next paragraph, you may remember you very kindly arranged for some members of your family to come to the Haemophilia Centre a little while ago to let us have a blood sample. We've kept this sample in the deep freeze, and I write to ask if you'd be agreeable to us testing this for evidence of previous infection by hepatitis virus. This will save members of your family coming up to the Haemophilia Centre again. Before testing the samples from our deep freeze, I should like to seek approval of those members of your family who kindly donated samples. And then you ask them to put their details and sign below. Now, this is a letter being sent in respect of testing for hepatitis. Is there any reason why you didn't use this same methodology in relation to testing for HTLV3?
No, we didn't. We'd have done it on an individual basis to talk to them before testing them.
Why was it that the centre held frozen blood samples of family members?
This was a study. The samples were collected originally as part of an assessment of a genetic test for tracing families, tracking haemophilia within families. There were a series of techniques for doing this. The gene had been identified in 1983 and 1984, and it became possible to track the gene through the family, not by, if I can put it this way, detecting the gene itself, but in detecting markers near the gene. At that stage, we couldn't identify the individual mutation, the individual variation in the gene that was causing the haemophilia. That's what we do nowadays, where we can identify the abnormal gene, what the abnormality is, and we can track that very simply by gene sequencing through the family. In those days, we could only track markers close to the factor VIII gene. There was one, I think it was published about 85, called ST14, which had quite a number of different variants, if I can put it that way. And its usefulness depended upon knowing the frequency of these variants within the population of people and relatives of people who had haemophilia. And so we were working with colleagues at the genetics unit at the Western General Hospital to look at the utility of this ST14 gene probe. And to do that, we needed to have samples from relatives.
That might explain why you'd have samples from those who are genetic relatives, but it wouldn't explain the holding of samples of those who were spouses or partners, would it?
Yes, it would, because one needs to know the frequency of the different variants, if I can put it that way, in partners who might have children, and then can assess the value of it in being able to track through the family. You need to have a population, an assessment within the population.
Do you know what steps have been taken to ensure that relatives or partners or spouses who were providing a blood sample, that they knew that it was going to be kept in a freeze for potential future usage?
Well, I think we would have made it clear that the sample would be going to another laboratory, or maybe it was our laboratory. We were working with a statistician at the Western. The sample needs to be separated and prepared, and the DNA extracted and frozen. So it is part of the processing of the sample.
What was the hepatitis testing that you were seeking by letters such as this to undertake in early 1986?
As I think the inquiry knows, the blood transfusion had a very active program on viruses transmitted by blood, and they had a project in the early and mid 1980s, about 1983, 84, 85, where they thought they had developed a marker for non-A, non-B hepatitis. And it was because of that that we wrote this letter. As it turned out, it wasn't a reliable marker of non-A, non-B hepatitis, so the project was not continued.
I want to just explore with you next, Professor Ludlam, a little more about the numbers infected and the dates of infection in terms of HTLV3. And I think we can do that most usefully by reference to the data in the Penrose report. Seamus, it's PRSE. Actually, I'm just going to check my reference. Look at me. I think I put an extra zero in again. It's PRSE 3070002. I hope. And if you could go, Seamus, it's numbered page 94. Electronically, it might be about 105 or so. Perfect. So we can see, picking it up at the bottom of the page, thanks. We saw from correspondence yesterday that initially there was a cohort, a group of 16 patients identified through your work with Dr. Tedder as HTLV3 positive. And then if we pick up the story here, you say, or the report states, Professor Ludlam stated that 23 haemophilia patients were infected with HIV as a result of treatment at the Edinburgh Centre. All 23 patients had severe haemophilia A. 18 of the 23 patients had received treatment with material from a single batch of SNBTS product during the relevant period and comprised the Edinburgh cohort. And if we look at footnote 272, we can see we get the numbers of the Edinburgh cohort 18. 5 patients had received treatment with other SNBTS and commercial products. If we go over the page and pick it up at paragraph 3.278, it says this: it was originally thought that all members of the Edinburgh cohort were infected between March and May 1984 after exposure to a single common batch of Scottish factor 8 concentrate. And then it says there are now thought to have been at least 2 batches of contaminated factor 8 responsible for infections in the group. It appears that 2 or 3 HIV-infected donors who were not intravenous drug users or heterosexual males contributed to the plasma pools. And then the next paragraph, one individual, E22 in the table below, is known to have been infected by ARMA factor 8 between 16 March and 1st December 1981. The dates of the last sample testing negative and the first testing positive. 1 E16 had samples that tested positive in 83. 1 E19 tested positive in November 1986, having tested negative in January 85. 2 E17 and 20 were under 16 at the time of their first positive sample. So before we look at the table on the next page, my understanding from this, Professor, and I just want you to confirm whether this is correct or correct me if it's wrong, 23 patients, all severe haemophilia A, 2 of them children, and 18 of them infected through a single batch of SNBTS product. And then we'll look at the other 5 in a moment. Is that correct?
Yes. I think one of the patients who became positive was treated at another haemophilia centre. And that information became available later, and it may be why this is 18 rather than 17, which has been a figure also reported. But overall, what you have stated is correct.
Oh, well, one of the questions that I've been asked to ask you, Professor, but by others, is to explain how the 16 of the cohort became 18, other than your belief that one may have been treated at another centre. Do you know what it was that subsequently suggested that there were 18 patients who had been infected by this one particular batch?
I have kept all the raw data that I received in relation to this episode, so it would be possible to go back and examine it. But I suspect the rise from 16 to 18, one was a patient treated at another haemophilia centre, and one is someone who hadn't been tested in the initially early in 1985.
And if we look at the next page, please, Shomik, we can just see the table. So we have there in table 316 the 23 patients. If we look at E19, we can see the date of the last negative result is given as the 1st of January 85. The first positive result, 17th of November 1986. Now that's a period when a patient should presumably have been receiving heat-treated product capable of eradicating HTLV3. Again, without telling us anything about individuals, are you able to tell us anything about the circumstances of that seroconversion and what the responsible product was?
I'm sorry, I can't. And I don't know whether they were a member of the cohort, whether they had received the implicated batch. I'm sorry, my memory is such, I would have known, but I'm sorry, I can't help you further.
The footnote on the previous page tells us that E19 is not a member of the cohort.
Oh, right. I'm sorry. I assume that this is accurate. I'm a little bit surprised that I don't remember, but the records may be available, and if obviously could be looked at. I did go through very carefully the records of all these patients for the Penrose inquiry with Dr. Hay, Professor Hay, because he was providing lists of patients, some of whom had moved into the area, some of whom had left. So I'm sorry, I can't help you further at the moment.
What had been the arrangements in Edinburgh for ensuring, once you found out that there had been certainly one infected batch, and this material suggests that there were a small number of other infected batches, but what were the arrangements in relation to those of your patients who might have had, on home therapy programs, had unheated product at home that they were using? What were the arrangements for ensuring that that ceased and that heated products took their place?
Immediately after the 10th of December meeting that we were considering yesterday, when I came back to Edinburgh, and the decision had been made to use heat-treated NHS concentrate, the blood transfusion had already heat-treated some of their product. And we immediately got in touch with all the patients who had stocks at home and asked them to bring them back immediately, and we give them replacement heat-treated therapy. So it was within days of the meeting on the 10th of December.
And are you confident that every patient who did have a supply of unheated products at home did bring it into the centre and have it exchanged?
I think I am pretty confident because we were very keen to get the unheated material back, and so the haemophilia sister would have. We were keen to see this. It was only a relatively small number of people. It was 40 or 50 people who we got in touch with and organised this for. It was a little bit of a logistic exercise at a slightly difficult time of year because it was a run up to Christmas, but it was a high priority, and that's what happened.
we look at one further document. It's HCDO 40/132_042. So this is a document, it appears to be dated 19th of December 1986 at the very bottom of the page. Just look at the bottom, please. Thanks. And then if we go back to the top, sorry, Shomik. So we can see it's Edinburgh. We've obviously redacted the details of the patient. Date of last anti-HIV negative test, January 83. Date of first anti-HIV positive test, June 84. And then if we go down the page to the next bit of handwriting, we can see, I think it says, I don't know if this is your handwriting or somebody else's, Professor, this patient was originally classified as HIV negative by Dr. Tedder, by RIA, but ELISA positive when tested subsequently. Therefore, the 1984 results were false negatives, and he is not, therefore, a 1984-86 seroconversion. He received the infected batch of NHS in March 1984. Is this an additional cohort member, or is this a cohort member that's part of the 18?
I struggled. You kindly sent this to me a little while ago, and I took a little while to understand it. And I think there's an error in this text. This is my handwriting. The fourth line, I think, should read, therefore, the 1983 result was a false negative. In other words, he was positive in 1983, and therefore he was not a seroconverter, but he had received the batch, the batch that we thought was infected.
Maybe I'm not going to take the time asking you to do it now, Professor, but it may be of assistance if you have a look at these dates and have a look, perhaps after we finish today, at table 316 and see whether you can ascertain whether this is a patient who features on table 3.16 and if so, where. But I won't take up time doing that now. If we go to, before we leave this document, if we just go to the top of the page again. Is this a document that's being sent to Oxford or elsewhere?
I think this it looks like it's for somewhere elsewhere, and the only elsewhere would be Oxford.
Certainly, I've seen forms from other centres in the same format. What did your patients know at this time about the information that you were providing to Oxford about them?
I can't remember. Patients were aware of the Oxford database and that their details were held on it, and that was the system by which they were able to get a haemophilia card. I'm sorry, I can't remember whether we told positively or prospectively, if I can put it that way, told patients that we were sending the data to Oxford. I should explain that the Oxford data was held in the Oxford Haemophilia Centre. It was processed on Oxford NHS computers, so it was all held confidentially within the National Health Service arrangements.
Could we look at paragraph 39 of your witness statement, Professor Ludlam, WITN 3428001, and it's page 13, please, Shomik. You say this, oh, sorry, I'll wait till it comes on screen. You say this in paragraph 39, picking up in the third paragraph, my active programme for monitoring the safety of blood products allowed early recognition of the exposure of patients to HTLV3 towards the end of 1984 and the almost immediate introduction of heat treatment in Scotland. And then you refer to the national recommendation, which is presumably the Elstree 10th of December meeting. As a result, there were no further infections by clotting factor concentrates with HTLV3 in Scotland. Now, just dealing with that last sentence first of all, we've already looked at table 316 at the case of a patient who appears to have seroconverted in 85 or 86. So what's the basis for your statement there that there were no further infections by clotting factor concentrates in Scotland?
The basis of saying there were no further infections was because we were following up all patients who received clotting factor concentrates with regular anti-HTLV3 testing. That was explained to two patients and everyone agreed. We discovered, or blood transfusion discovered, subsequently that can't remember exactly how many, but at least 2 donations had gone into the manufacture of different batches of factor VIII and had been given to patients by the time this was discovered, and none of the patients seroconverted. We wrote that up. Dr. Robert Cuthbert published that. I can give you the reference if it would be helpful, but I think it is in my statement. The patient we were talking about earlier that appeared to seroconvert in 1985, I'm sorry, I can't remember the details. I assume there was some other there may have been another explanation. They may not have received the batches that I've just been referring to. I'm sorry, I can't be more helpful than that.
And what did you mean in the earlier sentence where you said my active programme for monitoring the safety of blood products allowed early recognition of exposure? What was the active programme that you're referring to there? What did it comprise?
That was the hepatitis B regular assessment, the regular storage of samples so that if new infections arose, we could assess patients at the time or retrospectively or prospectively, and it was extremely useful. For example, in 1992, it became evident that virally inactivated concentrates would transmit hepatitis A. That was very surprising, because the dogma was that hepatitis A was hardly ever transmitted by blood or blood products for a variety of reasons I could go into if you wished. And therefore, suddenly, for people with haemophilia to find themselves being infected from concentrates by hepatitis A was quite unexpected and unusual. Caused a lot of interest and concern. As a result of this, when it was initially published, we got out the deep freeze of the latest samples from the patients and tested them for antibody to hepatitis A. As is perhaps well known, quite a lot of people develop antibody or are exposed to hepatitis A or used to be, and through community spread and had antibodies. The frequency of antibody positivity within the community, in fact, over the years has declined. But we were able to test these frozen samples, stored samples, and people who didn't have antibody to hepatitis A, we got in touch with straight away and offered them hepatitis A vaccine. The importance of this is that if an individual has liver disease, for example, non-A, non-B hepatitis, and they then get hepatitis A on top of that, they may well end up with more severe liver problems.
Professor, the purpose of my question was to try and see what it was about the programme of monitoring the safety of blood products which allowed for early recognition of exposure to patients in late 1984. Do I understand that what you're there referring to is the fact that you had stored samples and were therefore able to send them off to Dr. Tedder?
Yes.
And at the point in time at which you decided that you would avail yourself of Dr. Tedder's testing facilities, why didn't you make contact with the patients whose samples you wanted to send and ask them if they wanted to be tested and seek their consent?
At that stage, it didn't seem a particular issue. We thought of HTLV3 like other viruses, like the hepatitis B, and as we've considered earlier, it has many similarities in its epidemiology to hepatitis B. And so it didn't sort of seem all that much of an issue, and we thought it important to know the situation in the patients. And so that's why the samples were sent off. It was not until the implications of being positive, but in all sorts of ways, became clear to us, and all the consequences over the succeeding months and years that led to a different approach to helping patients who might be HTLV3 positive.
Okay. So I can see the time. Should we take the break now?
Yes, but just on the general theme that we've been discussing, I'd like to take you back to one document where something caught my eye. It's PRSE 302785, Shermack. This is the information sheet, which did or didn't go round with a letter from you. You think probably did, to patients and later to GPs. Second page, please. Paragraph 6, the last sentence. Now, this was sent out, as I understand it, in late December 1984. Am I right?
No, I think January 1985.
Thank you. So about half the patients in England and about 10% in Scotland have had exposure and are HTLV3 AB positive. Had you actually by then sent off even 10% of the samples which you had in respect of all your patients?
By this stage, we had results from the majority of patients who were concentrate users. My recollection.
In the whole of Scotland?
I knew the results from Glasgow because I was in touch, as you see, with my colleague, Dr. Forbes. Glasgow serves the west of Scotland, which is about half the population. Southeast Scotland serves about 1.5 million. The centres in Dundee, Aberdeen, Inverness also traditionally, and were at that time, had been SNBTS almost exclusive in their use of PFC material. So I based it on the basis of local population plus knowledge, because Glasgow had also published some of their data. Does that help?
Well, it's just I'm trying to understand. 10% is really quite a precise figure, and the questions arise: 10% of what? How is it measured? And you've given some indication of that. And about half the patients in England. That's a broad estimate from what you'd heard from south of the border, presumably.
I think that's the result of the paper that was in
the Lancet.
In the Lancet was 34% or something.
And that's about half.
Well, I'm sorry, I can't remember. I'd obviously heard from other people at the meeting on the 10th of December about their populations of patients, because some of those will have been tested.
Yes, I see.
It was, I'm sorry, they are approximate. I have said about half.
Yes, I fully appreciate that. If it was the Lancet paper, it would have been about a third. So obviously you could have information from somewhere else about that, and I appreciate you can't now remember what that might have been. Can you tell me, as far as Glasgow is concerned, did the centres there have a greater experience of using factor concentrate made commercially?
They at York Hill Hospital in the mid-1970s, the haematologist there was very keen to try and get prophylaxis. I think it was in children, certainly get them on to home treatment and prophylaxis. And the only way he could do that, I understand, was to use commercial concentrates, or they were certainly used for that.
Yes, was that Dr. Willoughby?
That was Dr. Willoughby, yes.
So, how did the results, the percentage in Glasgow, compare with the percentage in Edinburgh and the other centres which had used predominantly, or maybe in some cases exclusively, SNBTS produced concentrate?
My recollection is that the patients who had used exclusively or virtually exclusively SNBTS PFC factor 8 had a very low positivity rate for HIV, but those that received commercial had a higher rate.
And just pursuing that for one moment, was that a surprise to you, or was it what you might have expected from your general understanding of the transmissibility of the virus through the different forms of concentrate?
No, that was not a surprise to me.
Thank you very much. We'll take a break now till 5 to 12.
Thank you.